Alright, now is in on the city election, Chuba me, down some Yamlan Karchi was city Zambi, and Chike, Damian Rada, Lu Longelia, Chamachawache, and city down Chima in and Chima, and doing your George, say Yochima, when you go to Tobachi, Sambigi, Unoche, Ununda, you couldn't allow me to and on the Yamlan chair, the Carsaneda, some Gewachima, when you go to be Chudo, Luma using your cone, and Nature, Gana Chigme, Sambigida, Nature Tomiade, and Suzuki, Lu Longi, Tonacari, Gang to be one yash, Jimbat, Jalia, Tangi, Sempe, Jimbe Yamlanchia, and Jala Nubarachi, Rana Nuba Chumina, D, Sulu, Nuba Chavina, Palia, Nuba, Nubi, Lan, Koraki, and Panubi Java Chigme, Sembesum Servacomia, and the nigga giving Yamlanchia, Ravat Bemas, Yapuris, Tangi Muti Chiggin, Sempe, some tiding on the Dambo, Dambo ticket that somebody named Yamlan Dishi or Essay, that Jimba Dambo de.
Good morning. So let's do a brief recap of what we've looked at thus far. On the first day, we spoke about the need to abandon clinging to this life, where we saw that clinging to this life refers to clinging for or to all the pleasures of this life, or things perceived as pleasurable, our possessions, our friends, but also things such as what others think of us. It really comes down to an attitude where the mind is focused on this very life and without thoughts going beyond this life. Recognizing this very limited scope, we're encouraged to recognize the potential that this life has, which is to accumulate causes to ensure we have another excellent rebirth in our very next life. And so here, one is encouraged to let go of all that one clings to in this life, but develop a far more far-sighted outlook, looking beyond this life and having a focus on accumulating causes now that will be experienced in lives to come. And yeah, we think that there are the particular trainings of ethics, the determination not to bring harm to others through one's physical behavior, speech, or way of thinking. And secondly, that of generosity, that of giving of oneself in various ways, or in any way within one's capacity to be of help to others. And the third is that of patience, which, whereas with all the trainings, is a mental training where one trains one's mind to stay undisturbed in the face of adversity, whether from others or one's own inner turmoil, and lastly, that of enthusiastic perseverance. So these are the four causes to train in to ensure that one attains excellent rebirths.
Dimase, that in a Kamsumgi, Debatan, Sudan, Sumigi, Denige Kangalea, and a chick at Medushin, Shen Charge, Debaina, and a coalitor to Marati, that some time the Koa Kando, some time when they are Dungagi Rajan, Kangari, Nyingpo, Mindu, the Dele, the Tahudu, Sempe, Dele, Taje, that Tarbigo, the Topudu Sempigi, and some of that, the Nation Siore, the Nisamata, that Tarbigo to be Shudu, and Lunga Yisumgi, and then Diva, Nijukaya Chigme, Sempigi, that's on Suya de Dene and Suzuki, Longe, the Lu Longe, Gaitone, Shelia, Kunjola, Chivo Pieta, Shelia, Jimbatang, Tani, Sempigi, the Jimbaniam Nangia, and Dinaji, the Shina, Seba, Shengi, Neva Cheva Delia, Conrola, Pa Nubi, some the Tone, Ya landlord, the Chigme, Sempigi, some Subocomia, the name Yamnichedi, Baya, or Muti Chigin, Sempe, Junusamia. And the negative on the Digalia, Tavan, Dingas senior troop, the netting senior to net, damning to be shut up, Dusino Gomures, Diniam Nature, Diniam Nature Paladin, and Tabat of Tures, at Riba, Cousin Jimba Tambodi, some Tanadil, Danci Dino, Ya, Luki, Ya Yero Dine, Yasha Danci Dusiam Nature, the Res Casan to share the
When one has trained successfully in that first step of abandoning clinging to this life, then one lifts one's gaze further to train to abandon clinging to the three realms in their entirety. But it's important to train in the sequence presented, because successful training with regard to the first step means that one's focus has been lifted from the affairs of this life. These don't concern one much anymore. One is looking beyond this life. So one has a far more determined, focused attitude on the Dharma, not so caught up in this life's affairs. With this developed, then one is ready to look further, to give develop an even more far-sighted outlook, looking deeply at all the possible existences within samsara and seeing actually there's nothing worthy of striving for, of getting excited about, of wanting, of clinging to, because it all is subject to suffering. It is impermanent, it will not last, and I will remain trapped in the realms of suffering. And here, one now reflects deeply on the suffering nature of cyclic existence, of samsara, recognizing there's nothing to long for within the three realms. The only place where happiness can be found is when one is liberated from the three realms of samsara. One reflects on this again and again, developing both a wariness and a repulsion towards ongoing uncontrolled rebirth in samsara, and a definite or determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara. So one both has this rejection of cyclic existence, but also the positive attitude of there is something to emerge into. So it's not just a negative rejection, but it's a positive embracing of liberation. And to actually embrace liberation, one accumulates those specific causes. It's the same four causes mentioned earlier, but one does then now with a more powerful motivation. So one protects oneself ethically with a determination, I will not harm others because I don't want to create the causes that keep me bound in samsara. I am rather going to, by being ethical, create the causes to gain freedom from samsara. So too with generosity, patience, joyous perseverance. So one practices those same four trainings, but under this more powerful motivation. And then there are two additional crucial trainings introduced, that of the wisdom realizing selflessness, which itself needs to be conjoined with single-pointed concentration so that it has the stability and the strength to actually lead to one to attain liberation from samsara.
개와치면 원되고 뭐 톱되고 군노치와 이 군에라데 지말 춤어 주름나 지말아 소님네 제치 군노디 다디 군노 중화를 자고래 아니 다 니버디 나 마송도와 좀 감숨 콜웨 누가 타달래 저고도 셈베게 삼다에 되다 군노 말씀데 자치모죠 감수 콜웨 누가 타달래 줘야지 네 타르바 톱고도 셈베 삼다에 군노디다 딜레데 신여와데 군노베 슈 자체와 유베체와 자네 지상 군노 디 토네 당게 진바들라 소파냠네 제대제 어두시네 아 디레슈에다 군노데다 군노 슉 체셔디 셈제랑 코요둥아 타다랑 지부 많이 셈젠 탐제 코요둥아라 자시 산조고 뭐 토구도 셈베게다 군노 제쇼쇼기 니기 토네 안데 냠네 제고레세데 다 디레슈에다 타마 군노 제쇼쇼고 토네 냠네 제고데 이거 쉬야래.
In the very first session, I spoke about the motivations of varying strength, and we've looked in some detail at the first two. And just to recap, the first that we spoke about on our first day together was that by reflecting on the sufferings of the lower realms and developing a deep blissful aversion to the possibility of being born there, one develops the required motivation to accumulate the causes that will lead to rebirth in the higher realms, rebirth such as we have now in our next life. So this is a motivation that's quite a step up from where ordinary people are, because one's focus is on lives beyond this, not on this life's affairs. But then the second level of motivation, which is far more far-sighted, is where one recognizes that but even when I attain another excellent rebirth, like I have in this life, I'm still going to suffer. Because the lower realms are it's not only the lower realms that are pervaded by suffering, so too are the higher realms. There's nowhere within samsara where it will be free from suffering. Samsara in its entirety, all three realms, are pervaded by suffering. I do not want to suffer anymore. And with a weariness, a fatigue of this process of cyclic existence, of uncontrolled birth and death, and a repulsion for suffering and its causes, with this motivation, one engages in those same four trainings of ethics, generosity, patience, and enthusiastic perseverance, but with a far more powerful motivation, and then the two additional trainings of concentration and wisdom. So this is what we've covered thus far. In our first session together, I mentioned there is also a third, most powerful, a supreme motivation. And this is what we'll come to now. So this motivation comes about independence on the prime motivation, which itself comes about independence on the motivation prior to that. So there is a sequence in development. Because when one is given rise to that determination, that determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara and to gain liberation from suffering, that's the second motivation. Now, one recognizes all beings also want to gain freedom from suffering. I want each and every being to gain freedom from suffering, and I will ensure they do. And to do so, this is the first aspect, I will lead all beings to a state freed of suffering. And to do so, second attitude, I will become a Buddha. This is now the third motivation.
That's
This is then the third line in our verse. If you cling to self-interest, you are not a bodhisattva.
Rangdun Dugya Rangi Dunda Samjaya Tan Kunoji, Tak Legaro Karijana, Rangi Dunda Dugya Samtaje, Mundushine, Samtavina, and Jeju Simpike, Yamne Yabut, Detu Mares, Jejusim Yamne Chitu Mares, Jejusim Yamne Jimaduna, and the San Yoko to two Mares, or the Jatatulashina, Jasim Min said, Jeza Randa, Shen Yinane, Rangi Dunda, so some Tajan, Lega Karjanic Kuno Delia, Rangdungi, some logic. Samno Yuvaina, Digi and Janjusim Yamnichi to Mare, Janjusim Yamnichi Madonna Sanjako to Mare, is not Darton Lashina, Janjusim Jasimins, Rangi Dunda de Bay Yapora, Diki, Shimborisha, Smith, Gita Randun La Cha, Delia Shenjati, Randun de Chapa, Randula Rangi Dunda Cha. These are that the Bay Yaporas, DJ Horace, Shenje, and then Java Chingu, and then Kuno Dennis Kevin, and Janjusim Gulaki to Mare, Janjusim Gulaki Matuna, and Sanjako to Mares, and that Dordis Genetis More, Tautulation, Jansim means that.
Clinging to self-interest. So this is something we are deeply habituated to. It comes down to putting oneself first. And if one is still dominated or guided by this, or motivated by this self-interest, one will not be able to develop bodhicitta, and therefore one will not be able to become a bodhisattva, and therefore one will not be able to become a Buddha. To become a Buddha, one has to develop bodhicitta and therefore become a bodhisattva. But if one is clinging to self-interest, one cannot become a bodhisattva. Self-interest, or one's own benefits, can be expressed differently, one's own self-interest or self-benefits, is what has been dominating our attitude for lifetimes. A bodhisattva, on the other hand, has completely eradicated this attitude and in fact exchanged it for the other attitude of being motivated by other interests, or more clearly, the benefits of others. Because this word interest can be translated as benefits. So the bodhisattva is focused on the benefit of others, but the non-bodhisattva is focused on their own self-interest, their own benefits, achieving their own ends first and foremost. If others attain benefits as a side product, that is fine, but one oneself must achieve benefits. And this attitude prevents one from becoming a bodhisattva, from developing bodhicitta. Here then, one needs to recognize the role that striving for our own self-interest plays in our life. Recognize how we value this so. And this is pervasive in society, valuing one's own interest, pushing oneself to achieve for oneself or one's group. So we need to recognize this and then strive to eliminate this attitude of being concerned about one's own benefits. And do so by exchanging our focus from our own self-interest to having the interest of others first and foremost. Or, to express it differently, you can say the interest of others or the benefits of others. Coming to see that living a life where I'm striving to benefit all beings is significantly more important than striving to benefit just myself. And when one is able to exchange these two attitudes of self-interest, exchanging it for wanting to achieve the benefit of others, then with this attitude, one can develop bodhicitta, becoming a bodhisattva, and then can progress and become a Buddha. But one needs to first overcome self-interest. This attitude that we are being encouraged here, this attitude of pursuing our own self-interest, needs to be recognized clearly for what it is, because it's something that's pervasive throughout society, and society has pushed us to strive to achieve our own self-interest. because this is the attitude of all beings who are not Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, that they have the achievement of their own self-interest as their primary goal. And this doesn't mean that beings are pervaded by selfishness. We know this isn't the case for ourselves and others, or by selfishness alone. That is not the case. But the achievement of one's self-interest, this needs to be done before others can be helped. So for many people, where they have an abundance, they are happy to share that with others. But they see the need to take care of themselves as of primary importance. If things go well for others too, great, I'm happy for them. But I need to be okay first. And where this perhaps becomes particularly clear is when we see ourselves, as well as others, getting annoyed, frustrated, angry. What has led to the arisal of that affliction is one's self-interest not being fulfilled. When things don't go in accordance with one's wishes, one gets upset. When one doesn't get what one wants, one gets upset. When one gets what one does not want, one gets upset. So this is perhaps a clearer way to recognize the result of pursuing one's self-interest first and foremost. When one does not achieve it, the response is aversion, pushing away, repulsion, unhappiness. May come about as disappointment, feeling sad that one didn't achieve what one hoped for. So this, what is being described here, is the very way in society. We need to recognize, it's maybe easier to recognize in society, but we need to recognize it within ourselves. That we're wanting, first and foremost, to be looked after, ourselves to be okay, to have sufficient, and then look after others. And where we are forced to put others first, where we have a resentment against that, a pushback against it, a feeling that this is too much or unwanted, that shows our self-interest. Even though we may be having to put others first, we show that our self-interest or our self-concern is not being fulfilled. And therefore, we have an adverse reaction. This abandonment of self-interest is the primary object of abandonment for the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is primarily focused on ensuring that the pursuit of their own self-interest doesn't influence them. So this is a primary practice of the Bodhisattva.
Kunga kun tamche shoye gyures, rangi jisen gupo kun yuko, rangi jisen gupo kun yuko, sidi chesan rangi jeba zindio, dine kunwa di soso ya kanga chaya dan, soso ki anji yamu che yuzo jires, chesan di rangi jisen gupo kun yuko. Chesan da, manam jisen yunde kun yu, ka shisi de, manam, semjen tamche le digi tuyo da, semjen tamche kanga saya ki, dine ki kunwa di, shen, 조치 삼다디다 연대 탐지 준이기 규디디레스 만남 지지 연대 군유고 제가 말씀제 탐지를 디규트비에 동아세에 삼로 공원 din시여베나 연대 탐지 준이래 제가 잠 이제 자주쌤 안에 지금 산유고 받을 연대 자 폰소바 델레딘 중도 그래서 만남 말씀제 탐지 디규트비에 동아세에 공원 din시여베나 디기 아주 판도하겠지 뭐 라신이가 디규트비에서 랑이 지고 제바 진제 되는 줘야 되게 디 라신이가 강아지에 규리했다. 그래서 라 지진 거 보고 유고서 라 제바 진비 되는 게 진바디 동어군이 라래 강아지게 샬라 강아지게 라신이가 강아용하고 군로 삼르디 라신이가 강아용 규리해서 원래 그래서 the lama chapana lay or
This abandonment of self-interest, or most commonly you will have heard it expressed as self-cherishing. It's a different word, but the meaning is the same. This abandonment of self-cherishing, of placing oneself first and foremost, is the primary object of abandonment for the bodhisattva. And this you'll know well from the Lamrim prayer in the 94th verse. Please bless me to make my core practice the yoga of exchange of self for others, since cherishing myself is the doorway to all torment, whilst cherishing my mothers is the foundation for all that is good. So in this 94th verse, Panchen Rinpoche is presenting so clearly that it's our self-cherishing attitude, this attitude that puts our wishes first and foremost in our motivation, that causes all our problems and difficulties in life. But to the extent that we can change this and develop another cherishing attitude, an attitude where we hold others as dear, then this is the foundation for all that is good. Because it's in this way that one develops bodhicitta, and one's bodhicitta grows ever more, and Buddhahood is attained. So from this verse then, makes it very clear, these two lines. Since cherishing myself is the doorway to all torment, whilst cherishing my mothers is the foundation for all that is good.
미션다 윤도 주보셔야 미팅 바차야 가르스 용고에서네 저 삼는 돈이 거로다 삼나라 가려서네 소소선다 소소라는 직 된다지 주보에나 소소기 기시시시 된다 주보에나 아니 지금 현다지 시대 파초되기 아주 되바나시 마제바나 남사 당은 저기 셈이야 안지게 강세 콘라야다 아니 욕라라야 딜리고라 제가 랑게 된다 제가 네 된다 주마서서 나세데 제 네 된다 소소랑 된다 자침버서 네 된다디 그 클님에도 네 셰바디 얘기면도 나래야디 지기면도 선배게다 먼저 제상 하세 소소랑 게 자침버서 이제 파지디 소소게 되바나신 소소게 자침버 진마나 파줘디기 마지디 파줘들이야 강아대야다 콘라야다 안디로와 안지게 지난주에다 요다 전물에나래 집에나래나 다디한상 총교도네 안지게 대체밥을 요다다 안에디니게 마초 요다 뭐 차사다 네 아주디 네디 다보 가지 네디 야고 지금 네 예합 누구도 네디를 가지고 요라고 좀 현상다디 강아대야 책으로 아니 진짜네 안 할은 누구도 세다보 가서 말은 네 강아를 누구도 말이지 지금 배 삼다지 예도는 현담미도 받자상도 지리 예르기 미팅 바차야래 지휘团의 미팅 바차야래 그래서 조법 편진 타니버디게 미팅 바차야되게 자상 소소게 도시다 어딘 네 되바 나진 결혼 지금면도 네 되바의 결혼 킬링면도 네 결혼 랍교디 말 되바 바구면도서 디团의 되바 미팅데 주셔야 차기로 되바 미팅 바디 가서 소소게 되바는 아 세디바 지상 아 랑제바랑 소소라는 게 이제 첨부 삼다 되바 니기见前에 만족 강한 뭐 제상 라젠이가 미팅 바차야래 안지게 주보셔야래 이용해야 두신의 용고래 시간 두신의 삼러로 두스타면은 이 저로와데스까지 소소게 따와다 마팅 바지 파셔들 남는 안 주가 말와 아니 다 소소게 따와나 팀바지가 소소라지 제는 어디 파셔 되어가진 어디 야보래 그러와 들어와 그래서 니네게 주보셔야 차사디는 여러 중에 차사디로와 제사다 라지생이 삼러디 구보군지 요라야게 갈레라 차상기 뉴티네들 용고를 해야 돼. 근데 삼로디네 되는 용고로 하다.
The self-cherishing mind is where we grasp at ourselves as dear, which is a different word, but a different way to express self-interest, is where we want things to go in accordance with our wishes. And this way of thinking, this way of thinking is pervasive and is subtle. It's not necessarily something at the forefront of our mind, but it's certainly there and perhaps almost ever present. And how it's easier to recognize is by seeing the results of being guided by pursuing one's own self-interest or grasping at oneself as dear. So perhaps it's easiest to start by thinking about society, but it's imperative that you look at yourself. Wherever one sees conflict in the world, whether it's between nations or between peoples, at the base of that is their leaders' wishes not being fulfilled, and therefore, in order to fulfill their wishes, conflict is enacted. And we see it also in business, where business leaders may take advantage of their staff. They may deceive their customers, or they may act in ways that is destructive towards the environment. All of this is done in pursuit of their own self-interest. And then, if you take arguments, particularly if you think of a political discourse, but much more pervasively in our own lives too, where argument follows discussion, this is because someone has a view other than yours. They do not agree with your view. They maybe criticize your view. And this is now going against your own self-interest, hence the negative response. And again, now in terms of oneself, this negative response doesn't need to be expressed, but you feel it inside. There's an aversion that arises. This is related or comes from the self-interest, the self-cherishing attitude. And it's much more pervasive even than these examples. When one sees something one doesn't like, what one has seen and not liked is against one's own wishes. One hears something and considers it unpleasant or distasteful, it goes against one's own wishes. So looking like this, we see just how pervasive it is. That continuously there's a negative reaction, and this will come from things not going in accordance with how I want them to be. And even when once with, say, friends, and you're wanting to go somewhere or do something, or family members, if people have different ideas, one may well end up disappointed or maybe even annoyed. And that is just because things did not go in accordance with their wishes. So this pursuing of self-interest, or wanting one's self-interest to be fulfilled, the self-cherishing attitude, is pervasive for us. Hopefully, just from this brief presentation thus far, you've come to recognize just how pervasive it is within us. But this needs to be recognized clearly.
당보 ngaje dala shin 지상한 삼문하라 가려서 당보려야 nga 시가 nga 야부고도 nga지시 고 야부고도 시be nga진 중고래서 nga진 고래 디제는 안다 변해가지고 nga래 이네 디제야 아니 네잖아 네 쪽고 네 분야 네 파마 세드니 리레스 이네 당보 ngaje dala shin 다기 디제원라 다네 쪽고래 네 분야 네 파마래 네 잘라래서 근데 네 이자가 그래서 네 미리크레스 어두신에 삼로디 리기레스 안 딜레어도 안 가르리그레스는 안에 가르지그레스는 네 분야를 누구도 혼자 누구도 야고치기면 네 분야에 자워래 네 판매에 자워래 아주 판매를 누구도 쓰는 내내게 안 파절이야 안에 지금 코르라단 내가 얘기한 거래스 제가 코르게 하는 거래스 세상 네 잘라고 말이야서 네 잘라 누구도 네 잘라를 쳐라다 난주에 사정 초우도 난주에 개가로 누구도 어두신에 안에 지 코르라지 얘는 요모 계제 얘는 요모 레사지 le ya wang kudu china nga ko wa le ji ya ma rimba ra me pa ma ko wa le ye ji du shin ko ra ko du wa le yes ji san de ne za sem jen de ne ge sam da de ning je se wa da de ne ge ning ji du s ji za do la ning ji ju wa de la da mo nga je da la xin yu ji da ge ti ju su xun cha da ra wa me ba yi do la ning ji ju wa de la du de ne ge sam da de do la sem jen tam da ze ning ji sem be ning ji de ning ji de da be ma si za chi mu shu le de le la ba xian me sam ba de le ning ji de le la ba mi du sen ben den da da ba ge de ne ge da ba che ju je de ne ge ning ji de le che ba ji ba ro wa ning ji.
The great Indian master Chandrakirti, in one of the introductory verses to engaging in the middle way. So this is a remarkable text primarily on the correct view on emptiness. But one of his introductory verses is, through initially grasping at a self and I, follows attachment clinging to things as mine. Turning helplessly like buckets on a water wheel, to compassion for such migrators I prostrate. So the meaning of this verse is, going through it line by line, through initially grasping at a self and I. So this is something that we spoke about briefly yesterday afternoon, self-grasping, grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not. But this is the very root cause of all our suffering. Grasping at a self, as was mentioned yesterday, being the root cause of our suffering, the root cause of all the afflictions. Grasping at a self means we have a self, therefore there is other. If you have a self, there is that which is other from the self. Also, if you have a self, there are things that are seen to belong to that self. So this is the mind. That's the second line. Through initially grasping at a self and I, follows attachment, clinging to things as mine. So from initially grasping at a self and I, follows attachment, clinging to things as mine. Things as mine is very broad and should be understood like this. Of course, it refers to possessions, things, but also our relationships, our loved ones, our friends, our group, our race, our nationality, our views. All of these things that we cling to come from, this clinging as mine comes from grasping at a self. And what happens there? So this isn't then explicit in the verse, but what happens from there is that the afflictions arise and non-virtue is created. So when one grasps at a particular group as being mine, my family, my race, my nation, when we then perceive an other as causing them harm or standing in their way of success, we see that group or individual as an enemy. And we may well think to harm them, to take what is theirs, or we may, not wanting to harm them ourselves, be very happy when harm comes to them. So in this way, through initially grasping at a self and I, follows attachment clinging to things as mine. From that, all the other afflictions come, negative karma is accumulated, and one continues to circle in cyclic existence, taking uncontrolled rebirth, uncontrolled death, and so forth, remaining bound in suffering. And this is presented in the third line with the visual imagery of a water wheel. So a water wheel is this old-fashioned thing to grind corn or to grind barley that would turn in a stream and grind. So thinking of those buckets of water on that is the third line, turning helplessly like buckets on a water wheel. So this third line then is sentient beings are likened to the buckets on a water wheel that are turning. The water wheel turns under the power of the current. So sentient beings turn without any freedom due to the power of their afflictions and karma. And the final line is then how a skilled practitioner will look at them. A practitioner who has an understanding of bodhicitta and emptiness will look at them with compassion, recognizing the pitiful state of beings. So the fourth line, to compassion for such migrators, I prostrate. So here we really need to have a good look at the faults of the self-cherishing mind. To really recognize two aspects, how pervasive it is, and that it only leads to problems, to faults, to harm. And this has to be recognized because this is not how we have seen things thus far, and it's certainly not how society encourages us to look. Striving for one's own interest is praised, it's encouraged, it's seen as the right way to go about things. Here in the Mahayana, one is forced to confront this mistaken view. The first step here in the meditation is to reflect deeply on the faults of grasping at oneself as dear, the self-cherishing mind. And amongst the many faults, because I've described some ways to look at it, to see how from this follows the afflictions and suffering. Also, a second key component in terms of the faults of grasping at oneself as dear is that this mind closes the possibility of us becoming bodhisattvas. As long as this mind is what leads us, the paths of the bodhisattva remain closed, and therefore the attainment of Buddhahood is an impossibility. So when one looks at the faults of compassion, the faults of self-cherishing, one conjoins this with recognizing the benefits of an opposite approach. Because when one sees the faults of self-cherishing, one recognizes the harm it does to all those under the control, the influence of self-cherishing, which for now includes oneself, but all others. This leads to the generation of compassion. The wish for others to be freed of suffering means wanting them not just to be freed of the results of suffering, but really the causes of suffering. And there we include their self-cherishing minds. So we generate the compassion. May all beings be free of the self-cherishing mind. All beings will include oneself. May we no longer be bound by pursuing our self-interest, which is so often at the expense of others. And then one can develop this further to a determination. In fact, I will make sure all beings are guided to gain freedom from this self-cherishing attitude. And here one then also will reflect on the benefits of cherishing others, which comes together with being a genuine compassionate attitude towards others, where one values others.
yeah. And in some time, Anzu Karesam Gore, Anzu Samana Kaligis, Rang chasing a some of the Q and the Meva Sore, Shangi, Dunda, Shandy, some said, did that? Tata Maria something as a Lolia, Chia, Kunimiduade. Arsene, Rang Yaku, Rang Cheva Mazina, and the Kares Misiki warriors, and Hakalas how those. Nadia Kalas were twin to those. She said, Dinig sometimes twin Maduban. 간을 숨겨줘야 돼. 랑 지진데 랑 숨겨줘야. 랑이 디기주야. 랑이 미세기야. 강하세기. 삼로디 랑을 제바 랑 야고 구세메 삼로 주야나. 아니 랑이 디기주야다. 랑이 강하세야다. 안 뭐반에 디차데. 디 연구를 삼로디면은 랑 숨겨제 두 말에 세베게. 당한도 삼로나 디코로 와다. 근데 먼저 삼 코로 와. 但现在也现在也我觉也现在也碰到这种让叫我去让明没要是叫我去刚刚修这搞的是这第三大的别弄出来是别个咱们认识是了的。
This view of the Mahayana of it being imperative to abandon grasping at oneself as dear and rather embrace wholeheartedly holding others as dear. This view of the Mahayana is radical. It is completely against everything we have learnt from society. It's completely against the values of society where one genuinely puts the needs of others first. So therefore, one should have a visceral reaction to this. But what about me? Who's going to look after me? If I am focused on others, what about my own needs? Am I supposed to then go hungry and be joyful about this? Am I supposed to live in poverty and be joyful about this because I'm looking after others? So such a response should come because this view of the Mahayana is so radical, so contrary to the generally accepted views of society.
제가 디네레 대인상한테 지소나냐 롭장 제리 코로나냐 어디 소소라나 야부치고다 소소라나 숨겨 야부치고다 소소라나 된다 그러는지 롭장 디치고로 총기다고 지지 미 소소리아 지제는 파데는 제고서디 아주 소수기 송야기 제신디 아주 롭장 제고로 왔다 롭장지는 라다는 디신 주고로 왔다.
Society, our upbringings and society as a whole has encouraged us to develop various skills, gain an education, develop social skills, to develop various skills for the workplace so that we can look after ourselves because it's a harsh world out there. And if we don't take care of ourselves, who will? So we've been pushed in this self-cherishing attitude, this attitude which comes naturally to us. We've been pushed in this direction anyway, making it deeply ingrained within.
네. 제자들 랑 지진이 삼로티 저기 디기 주야다 소수의 강한 세계 순교 소소 순교기 삼로티 예침벌에서 당한 저기 넘기는 디 삼고래 디 연통고 말디 연den통고로 연den통 안디 통행한 저기 자와견야 제디고라 제자들 랑게도 나 말씀이 랑든 말씀바지 현야지 제대변에 디 랑든 마주바지 랑이 강한 책이래 안지 현삼 다는 디 다다 책 말, 진짜 랑이 숨겨지 두 말, 랑이 숨겨지 뭐다나 랑이 숨겨 처진 주두 말, 랑이 강한 세도 말, 이디나 동아 자자다 교우 자자 자루 그래서 비게 당아서 삼나라디 이 여와 이 여반사 당한 저기 랑 제생의 삼도 배배 숙침보지 배 숙침보다 배시 이 쇼던 거로 받은 거죠.
So this view of the Mahayana is radically against what the socially accepted norms. We see achieving our self-interest first and foremost as beneficial. Society encourages us to do this. Look after yourself. Look after your family. If you don't, who is going to? If you're not looking after yourself, how can you expect others to do it for you? You're just going to be lazy and expecting to live off others. And if you're not looking after the I and the mind, so for example, one's family, how can you expect others to do this? Just look around you. If you don't look after yourself, who's going to look after you? So we see there that, because I'm saying here is not something you've heard for the first time. This is the view of society. You have to look after yourself. And this is the view we came into this life with, and we have followed. Taking care of myself first and foremost. Because if I do not, I will have problems. So this has been our guiding light thus far.
That's not you check you should not do that the ranches and some of the massive no to chambore, the Rajinical Gade, the Moya, touch the Moya. Then the Conto said, Rajinical Gade, said that Yawachima Chasala Gade, Conto said, Moya, Dusho did it, the Dosho Sevocom was said, then the Kadarus, Lucian, the Chenala, the Conto said, Ducure, Dupet Chishore, the Conto said, Moya, the Dosho Sevocom, the Yashua said. Ranches in some of the Moya, did Ducure. 지난 뒤도죠 현재지 인지 공부를 해야 돼. this 나중에 점점 나도 지소나려고 요거 치쇼 예 치쇼디 아니 최저나 야 시에도 안디 먹어야다 두효로지 아니 송교로 와다 제자들이 지송여도 아주 로르야 취야 배 갈갈이 하고 자고로 와다.
It's not only the view that the self-cherishing mind needs to be abandoned and replaced with other cherishing mind that is contrary to the values of society. Many other presentations in the Dharma in general, not just the Mahayana, but the Dharma in general, go against the values of society. Hence, living in a society such as this, but trying to do so in accordance with the values of the Dharma is challenging. And therefore, it is difficult to change our ingrained ways of thinking because society is not supporting us. A further example, you would have heard countless times in Buddhist teachings that anger is always wrong, it is only ever harmful and destructive, and it is never, ever justified. You will not hear that in society. Anger is required, society will tell you. Not at all times, but without anger, how are you going to protect yourselves? And if you don't stand up for yourself, be strong and dominant, others will take advantage of you. If you show yourself as a patient person, you'll be seen as meek, and others who are more dominant will take advantage of you. This is the common view in society. It's how we would have been raised. It's the influences from society. And therefore, when one now, within that same society, is trying to have a patient attitude, an attitude where one's mind actually is not getting disturbed at all, even when others are acting in an abusive manner or shouting at one and so forth. This is difficult because it is contrary to the values of society. One stands out from society. Hence, it is difficult to change. And also, this is then the same as what we're talking about here. Abandoning self-cherishing, pursuing one's self-interest, for rather looking at the greater good, the needs of all.
제사당 안주게 랑지선세 빼기 첨보랑 아주 판도치 고구려 세다 콘르세야 돼 안주를 고우도 안주를 대 손교체로 고구려 세야 돼 다상이 좀내 유네 냠내 마셔봐지 빼도 변 통제 비쳐서 돌잖아 아니 도쇼 잠니지 다 아니 지금 미셔메기 삼바 아니 쇠비 삼바 냠내 제주 도시는 냠내 제로로 와다 제사다 냠내 두스 저르데 지다데 상이 좀내 냠내 저나 다 상이 좀내 지금 랑지선이 파도르 콘로 파도르네 상이 좀내 강한 가르쳐야 그랬어 디 강한 가르쳐야 그랬어 아니 요다 그 미 콜리아 요다 강한 상이 좀내 뇨라다 강아수에 배 뇨라 갈때 버렸어. 현다게 갈때 버렸어. 안 제자 상의 줌내들은 뇨라 시간 중요 막 강아지 해 중요 막 상의 줌내데 코로나에 배 셈버 되고 기우시는 게 되는 상기 다들 봐도로 이동합들 상의 줌내에서 기 랍제되게 다들 있는 하나도 냠는 제되게 디체서 다되게 유예돼 받자고 그래. 제자 상의 줌내에서 시디 미디 고요는 미전다에 섬리야 가랑라지나 어배 약보지리 셈비기 지 삼지 코르마도 미두자를 유예해서 삼코한 지요 말봐. 제가 디가서 랑든 삼는 파도 콩도 삼바디 괜다 디스파 빵 되네 잠니 주고 쇠비 냠네 제 디 제보디 되네 쇼와도 와데 현심자 탐절 판도 티야시 무도 되게 미망보 안디 제소 장 해야 땡아 예디게 땡아 다 야보래서 나도 고물루를 써봐다 되네 야갈 망보 안디 지 점랑 가지가는 아상 요즘는 이게 제소 장제 냠네 제 뒤다데네 망보 쇼주에 되게 책으로 와다 이 상해 점내 디게 랑된 랑지징 삼로파 도르 콩도도 파 도르 균다 이 도초 잠니 조금 안 쇠베님은 지기 다 제보책으로 와다.
So I think it's, as you hear ever more Buddhist teachings, and where you hear the values of Buddhism and see how they are contradictory to the values of society, take that to heart, recognizing that to develop the qualities of Buddhism within in a society that is not supportive is challenging. And in this way, one accepts the reality of one's situation. But moreover, one needs to really look deeply at how pervasive these faulty values are within each of us, so that we can apply the required energy to them, to eradicating them, and to be comfortable within ourselves when we are within society, but actually a little apart from it. So, for example, I'm just mentioning two, but there are other values of Buddhism that are contrary to what society holds, what society values. So that of the Buddha teaches the need to abandon grasping at oneself as dear, and to rather strive in cultivating the opposite, holding others as dear, placing the greater good, the needs of others first and foremost. And the other illustration was the need to completely abandon anger, to never see it as justified no matter the circumstance, but to rather practice patience. So these are two examples of several views of Buddhism that are contrary to society. So when one's asking oneself how to proceed, should I adopt the views of the Buddha or not? Ask oneself, so what was the result of practicing what is the result of practicing these views? We can think then to the historical Buddha. The Buddha lived under these guises, developed these qualities to the point of perfection, hence became a Buddha. And what problems did the Buddha receive by going through society free of anger and going through society guided by benefiting others? What problems did the Buddha receive from this? Absolutely none. Even where others were critical of the Buddha, what problems did the Buddha receive? None, because of this radically transformed mind. And moreover, the beneficial activities of the Buddha were not only experienced by those who had the great karma to be in his direct presence, but for more than 2,500 years, countless millions of beings are being benefited by his teachings. That is the outcome of training in minds such as these to the point of perfection. But of course, it's not just the Buddha and other Buddhas, but the Bodhisattvas too. So we can think of the great Bodhisattvas from ancient India, such as Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and so forth, and the many from ancient Tibet and those in the world today. These Bodhisattvas of varying level of development are guided by the other cherishing mind, are guided by patience. So what problems do they experience? Others may disagree with them, Others certainly will hold views that are different to them. Others may even speak or act in a nasty way towards them. But what problems, what suffering are they experiencing? So by looking at our role models, the examples of the training, we can see the results of this practice, the results of recognizing that certain values in society are wrong, and having the strength of mind, the inner conviction, the courageous attitude to, whilst being part of the society, to step outside of it.
Nyingpo an jamni je komya da an sebe nyamne je dusi nangore jezade nangyo ba za rang ji jing ye samlo da khongzho ji gi me samlo da dangyo ma de ine 여름 질야 송급 제겐 안 지게 다도 시간 매바 요마르바 안 튕긴 돈에 강아 가요 마세요 돈야도 도로한테 강아 가치요 마라 제가 되니기 돈에 안 델야 요라시아네 교오데 되니기가 지수즈 요라시 해서 가요 마르바 제가 이 맞이 경험치기 제수 장제 다 장수 제수 장제 경험치기 송주 쉬어야 로마 제수 장제 저 점리 가제 갈래 먹고 해야 되고 봐 제가 이게 자하게 셈을 흘려다 판도 쉬우 용거로 봐 네가서 무슨 통치스 교바 뒤 경험제라서 봐 되니게 남아 먹고요 봐 제가 코로나 주기 잠니지 랑치징에 삼로들 꾼다 코로를 꾼다 디냠스 말은 파 도르지 디냠보된 잠니지 고미하다 제베님은 제가 될래야 제가 아주 통치스 교바래요 아니지 배 셈베기고 미샤나게 뛰어가요 봐 아니 소수게 튕겨나 강에 토네야 지금 루셈 강에 토네가 강에 메디게 미샤 배지 뛰어가요 미신게 제수 장관 배 숙침 보여 되게 아니 지금 여름제 되니게 찬로 고여도 이제 어디 미디 약보를 배 약보를 다 심리야 가랑나 제데 이제 되니게 이게 와야돼 이 용거로 받아 제자디 랑 지진의 삼로 균 파도 아니 콩저디 파도르제 안 되니게 제베네 제가 야구 용구마도 강아시 용분도 하다 같이 맞아 통신시켜 볼래 되니게 여러 하다 배로 배선로 지네.
And often it can be easier to look at the living examples in our world today rather than the historical figures we just read about. So we can think of His Holiness. So His Holiness, he, in the many decades he's been teaching about the faults of anger and the faults of grasping at oneself as dear and the need to cultivate the opposite, to cultivate holding others as dear, to cultivate love, compassion, and patience. So he's been teaching in this way for decades. And as a lived example, he's been living a life of someone guided by love and compassion, guided by a striving to benefit all beings, not pursuing self-interest. So he's lived in accordance with these faultless teachings of the Buddhist tradition. And if we ask ourselves, what problems has His Holiness received from living in this way? And the truth is, he himself has not received any problems from this. When he's around others, or he's teaching, or he's interacting with various people, there'll be some who disagree with him, some who criticize him, some who wag their finger. But what response would have someone who's trained in love, compassion, and patience have? Just compassion. So even when on the receiving end of others' criticism, of others perhaps wanting to take advantage of him, his response is one of compassion, naturally arising within. So that he is not suffering. And of course, the majority of people that think of His Holiness, who interact with His Holiness, will have the opposite view. Meeting him, hearing his voice, hearing his teachings, great joy will arise in their mind. And His Holiness, aware of this, he will be happy, but not for himself, oh, aren't I wonderful, but he'll be happy that they are experiencing happiness. So we see from the example of His Holiness that by living in accordance with these teachings, he doesn't experience any problems, no matter what the reaction from others. And whilst he is the most visible example in our world, there are many other great lamas who, across the traditions, who have developed these qualities and live in accordance with these qualities. And they do not suffer from these. They do not suffer from not holding particular values of society, but holding the contrary values of the Dharma.
那都是，当然俺什么记不定俺这个俺就说呢，什么的让阶层的过过来，就像俺这空着过过来，说送给节，所以这个就别了呀，俺刚刚写了让阶层的，那说个空着是没完呢，那这个主要的让给送给节图嘛的，身边个三六有缘解决，俺是地头呢什么单位呢？那让阶层当俺写的让阶层修清不节，现在俺。你结合这个药物，你密码这个药物为什么？但让阶层他呢，什么修清不见，的那个他呢，什么大修清不见的人，他什么单位呢？的那个阶段个阶级，那让你药物样样的，让你往昔是药物来呀，让你个吞咽药物来呀，让你个那块蒙古呀结合，这让你结合这个药物样样的，等到了什么修清不当前呢？的那个什么这个。的那个属的嘛，的那空着的个什么大都是这样大的都什么的必须当前，当然这个的那个技术哪里啊，就像里啊马家呀，他老说把的，的那个现在刚刚蒙古就没，现在就没老说把的，的那时候蒙古就有了的，加上的那个什么有些的个，按那主这部的来看用的是呢，现蒙古这来刚刚这样，现在看不多呀，现在所学啊老说把。都现在现在刚刚蒙不出呀，那地方就所以呢，给地呢就没这个现在的内容在这种，俺也觉得俺说了内容是别个，所以体育看的，但里所说个做不的是呢，立马就我的这个搞起来我们的身边的，俺都这样的，俺这个国当然的是别个那么多些呢，加上让马几吧，马是现在马几吧是，那你的媒体西上边呢，蒙把那个知道。媒体这些个天天接要的呢，俺这个两节嘛，过个是嘛就那么就这些都是呢，结果了吧？真的是媒体什么呀？各样的呢，你起码媒体西山呢，实际内面呢，西的罗马我前边呢，实际各样的媒体读书讲究要的，媒体白的呢，中国的媒体那个虽然大这边，国军节前呢，这马哈瓦这些什么的结果了吧的，加上现阶层的什么当的30年代大的时候呢。搞不起来的，忙不没完的，罗忙不前边那背下过来是对我是这个了。加上都现在什么大把的让阶层也什么当，看到俺就去做那来让送给这国国的身边什么的，修全部有吧呢？你给眼前呢，他让现在刚刚这样用他们，所以让嘛几个钱，加上的那些有吧的，俺就税务了吧，通过了吧的，的那个钱呢，税务通过了吧的。加上的那个好让就是修全部约定的这个，因那的那个俺那马几吧，好让马几吧，所属于中国你吧的地方，没上去呢，所属于这个这所以呢，罗马几吧，搞这样是被多半那么大卡拉社会呢，这多半现在啥社会的，你给的呢，古生活体对话的，人家这个了吧的，加上的让这就修全部吧，让这是对了，你这个让你送给这个让这些什么修全部有吧。因为控制第一送给就是现在控制全面的，那么这个什么修全部有的吧呢？第二个团呢，刚刚有吧的俺就同学说给吧，差不多就是的，就是让阶层也什么过来的，现阶层也什么当呢？的就这样的什么当呢？那就的我说通多的。
Primary part of the meditation is coming to recognize both the pervasiveness of the self-cherishing attitude within, as well as its faults, that it is only harmful. And as I've presented, this needs to be done clearly because society pushes us in the opposite direction. People will ask you, but if you do not stand up for yourself, if you do not get angry at injustice inflicted upon you, if you don't pursue your self-interest, what's going to happen of you? This view of the Mahayana is radical and contrary to what society values and has been preaching to us our whole lives. So we need to be very clear on the faults of self-cherishing for ourselves and the pervasiveness of self-cherishing. We need to recognize this for ourselves. And here then I encourage you to look, when we were speaking yesterday about faults of cyclic existence, the various sufferings of samsara, to look at your suffering experiences or experiences of suffering and see how beneath that is the self-cherishing. Things not going in accordance with my wishes. Things going, meeting the unwanted, not getting what I want. Being separated from what I want. Insatiability, and so forth. These sufferings of samsara that we experience have beneath these experiences the self-cherishing. It's not going how I want. And also look within, which is the most important, but to aid that, observe society. And where you see unwanted as situations in society, recognize that the actors, the perpetrators, their minds are afflicted, and beneath those afflictions is the pursuit of their own self-interest. You can see this in terms of those engaged in environmental destruction, those engaged in crime of various ways, those engaged in deceit, taking advantage of others, those who have conflict, argument, and perhaps most obvious is that of warfare, where conflict is at its maximum expression. When we observe warfare from the comforts of our home, recognize that those who make the decision to go to war, and those who follow out that decision and send the bombs and the missiles and the bullets, behind that wish, behind the motivation leading to that action, is a wish to achieve one's own interest for oneself and the I and the mine, my group. And what is the result of following self-interest? Homes that were a place of safety, of warmth, of love, are destroyed. Communities destroyed. This is the most obvious result of self-interest. But it's in our own lived experience. Most of us, hopefully none of us, have such experience in this life. But where we do have experience, it's the biting words. Words that can cause harm. Words that we remember from years ago that still cause us pain. These were expressed by ourselves or someone else from a basis of self-interest. So this grasping at oneself as dear, whilst so encouraged by society, it just leads to pain in these ways. And the more self-obsessed a society is, the more, maybe you could say individualistic a society is, the greater the problems will come from this mind, because it is so much stronger. And the less interest there will be in benefiting others, the more difficult it will be to see, if I don't get this, but all of them get that, this is fantastic. That will not appear to such a person's mind. Only the achievement of their self-interest matters. And we can see this in leaders in the world. And for those who act out their self-interest, particularly in terms of aggression, conflict, warfare, because they have so much more power, they themselves end up being in ever more danger, and they need legions of bodyguards to protect them. This too is the result of following one's self-interest.
Oh yeah. 어디네 자당이 가르 주거리 람나 등아들이 지소하나 랑 제진의 삼로도 배 기주도 공로도 기침부제 랑송교 제레사디기 다 대시 제주신배 냠는 제레디 교연 탐지 중요하래 세디 지나다 이니게 교연 간에 가다 연구요 세디 데네티네 연구도 와세베 당도 삼로도 안에 랑 제진 삼로요나 대교연 데네티네 연구도 와세베다 등아도 시네 배선을 뒤슈바래 지자다 현 제진랑 현 제벌신의 삼로디 당배나 어느 쇠고 검제 제배나 Digi and the Russian Yigal Pembachun could be the San Jim de la Sopa Dusin, Yamden Navar, Yamden Nani, Uncoronzuli Dusin, and she Gushepchi had a Zivu chair, the horns of Digi Yamaze, Shen Jesutra, Misha on the Digi tree, Digi United in the Umudu Asiveda, Ranganjizing in some Yun, some Dana, Dusus Tamban, and to get Ratre in the Duasia. The Shen Chizing somebody Tamban, and also how good the 20 didn't in the Duasi patient of Chiduchin. Now that you got it. Is a Dadulation that has means said it is a Rang Jeba since Tibana, Ninjacom to Martin, some get too much as a Rang Chizing somebody. Yun Chimbore said it, Yun Roach, Ontaro, Dinity, Duasia, some Dana, Dinish said it. Chisogi, some Dana, Dinity, that Delia, Yun, some Damen, Dinity, Onduasi, with Lucian, Shimju Chevana, Dinner chasing somebody, Yun. But how to but the niggy some Shimju Machina, Ran chasing somebody, a sosu Sunkup chair down, and socially Pando drinking mato, never young honey, but some tomorrow. All that issue in the issue, that thing to get that, and you want your brother to moody share it.
Just to briefly summarize some of what we've looked at this morning, is that in order to become a bodhisattva, the self-cherishing mind has to be abandoned. The pursuit of one's self-interest has to be abandoned. And this is really difficult to do because of lifetimes of following our self-interest and being encouraged by our society to do so. So therefore, in dependence on all the merit and skill in meditation one has acquired up to this point, here then one focuses on looking at both the pervasiveness of the self-cherishing within and that it only ever leads to harm. So that, like with anger, one recognizes following one's own self-interest is never justified. It only leads to harm. And to aid us in this reflection, call to mind our role models, those who inspire us, the Buddha, the great bodhisattvas. They are living the result of having abandoned self-cherishing, the result of living with a mind of real patience. And recognize that whilst it is a little frightening to develop to abandon the self-cherishing attitude, this attitude that we see as our protection, the result is not one of suffering, but lasting happiness. And moreover, to be very clear, that if we have an aspiration to become a bodhisattva, we cannot develop the prerequisite of great compassion if we are dominated by self-cherishing. So therefore, the initial generation of bodhicitta and the arisal of being a bodhisattva remains blocked to us as long as this attitude pursuing one's own self-interest dominates. So use this to motivate oneself to look deeply within, see the pervasiveness and the faults of the self-cherishing attitude, and have the determination to abandon it, to live free of it. So we conclude there for this morning, and we'll continue from here this afternoon. So between now and when we get together, you have some time alone, some time together with Venerable Seppo, and there you have an opportunity to, whilst you are together, whilst you are alone, to look within yourself, look for this pervasiveness of the self-cherishing, and recognize how it only causes harm.
Oh, yeah.